Hey everybody, welcome to the Tech Founder Show, where we have discussions with leading edge technology founders who are leading the charge of rapid innovation using disruptive technologies. Joined here by my co-host Andy Halco. Andy, happy Tech Tuesday to you.
Happy Tech Tuesday to you too. I am excited for another great show. Tell us, who do we have and what are we talking about?
Yeah, so I'm excited. So we've done a couple shows on different topics. This one I like because it focuses really on the physical world, the world of mobility. So Meghan Braley, who I'll bring on in just a moment, she's the founder and CEO of ScootRoute. And ScootRoute, which is available in all 50 states, it's an app. It's a free app designed specifically for micro mobility travel. It allows users the ability to have voice-activated custom navigation for motor scooters, e-scooters, bikes, and e-bikes in both cities and suburbs. The app combines 3 different mapping technologies to accommodate the nuances of micro-mobility travel. So with that, Meghan, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time to spend with us. So I gave a little bit of the short description of ScootRoute, but we'd love to hear, from your perspective, what is it all about?
Yeah, sure. So it was a very good description, so thank you. So ScootRoute is, it's a mobile navigation app dedicated specifically to micromobility. So if you think about micromobility, it's really anything on 2 or 3 wheels that goes less than 30 miles an hour. So, and you had kind of mentioned it, so it could be just a bike, it could be an e-bike, a skateboard, a hoverboard, a one wheel, really like anything that people are using to navigate around the city that isn't a car. And so myself, I'm a Vespa rider. I've had one for well over 10 years now. And when I first got it, I always struggled trying to get to where I needed to go without getting on major roads or really feeling like I had to fight cars. In Boston, we can ride mopeds in the bike lanes. So trying to figure out, where I could be riding or should be riding was really hard. And so that's really where the idea came about. And we launched in August in both app stores, and we're really excited about it, and we're getting some really great user traction, which is good.
So going back to just the origin, so you're a Vespa rider, and it was really the challenges that you were facing?
Exactly. Yeah, I am literally ScootRoute's first client. So cool. And that it was really hard, and I don't know of any of your listeners are from the Boston area, or if you've been to Boston, the streets are an absolute nightmare. So I really felt very unsafe when I was first riding because I didn't know the fastest way to go. And, Google Maps wasn't really helpful because they only have the ability to you have one option to avoid main roads or busy roads. And then I don't even think Waze was around at that time. So there was really nothing out there for me.
It's interesting.
So what was that process of going from, I've got this idea, this problem, to, okay, now I need to create a solution and I want to create a solution?
Right. Well, I actually sat on the idea for a very long time. So I've owned the domain name ScootRoute.com since 2010. And wow. So this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. But I was really the only person, especially in Boston. And Boston is actually not a huge micromobility city yet. We're working on it. But the market in the US just wasn't there. There were not, birds and limes and, electric kick scooters weren't a thing yet. Those really didn't come around until 2017, 2018. E-bikes were not big. Some people had mopeds, so the market wasn't there. So there was no point in me launching it to me be literally the only user of ScootRoute. So I really had to make wait for the market to catch up. It happened in 2017, 2018, and that's when I really had decided to kind of pull the trigger. And I'm a product manager by trade, so I've been in the product management space but in corporate fintech companies. So luckily I was used to kind of building requirements and being able to communicate that to developers. So I had a little bit of a leg up there and when, thinking about how I was going to launch the product.
So you if you bought the domain name in 2010, you were obviously sitting on this for a while. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious because I think people do that all the time. What were kind of the ups and downs of thinking about like, oh, I've got to do this versus pulling back and saying it's not the right time? And then how did you say you saw the right time coming, and obviously with some of these things, but what really solidified it for you to say, okay, I've got to move forward?
Yeah. So, there were definitely ups and downs, and it was more just like me internally being like, all right, I'm just gonna hold off for this in a while. And I had talked with, my family and friends about it. Like everyone knew about ScootRoute, even though there was no product, it was just an idea. And so like every year at Christmas, my family was like, hey, what's going on with ScootRoute? And I'm like, oh, nothing. Or like, yeah, I'm not going to do it, because like there was like at the time, there just really wasn't the point. It would only be, I'd develop an app and I'd lose money on it, right? I'd lose that development cost. But really the solidifying moment was when Bird and Lime started to get, VC funding after VC funding after VC funding, right? They were really blowing up. And I will never forget it. It was when I had already started, at the time, I had already started, ScootRoute. I created an LLC. Once I had kind of made the decision that I'm going to move forward, did that, hired a development shop to help me with the proof of concept and the technical architecture. But then it kind of became clear that it needed to be my full-time job. And I'll never forget, it was like a Tuesday night, and I was, just doing market research. And I was like, if I don't do this now, someone's going to come in and do it. So that night I was like, all right, I'm going like both feet in here. And I gave my notice at my job the next day. And it was the scariest thing I've done, but it was also the best thing I've done. So it was just kind of, what the VCs and the development world was investing in the micromobility industry that really kind of gave me the push. And it's like, this is going to be the next big thing.
That's awesome.
So where did you get your, first few users?
So really that was through just kind of PR. I mean, once we launched the app, it was really through PR, some app advertising. We're actually just starting a huge app store optimization strategy with, a company, and they'll help with user acquisition, because that's kind of like our biggest goal now, right, is to attract new users. But really it was just through more like press releases. I have, some friends, building the app. I obviously needed to talk to actual micromobility writers. So it was kind of like that product, kind of like expert group that I would tap into for fleshing out my requirements and market needs. And they were really my first ones.
So did you, before launching the product, did you have conversations with other writers just to get feedback? Obviously you kind of knew what you would like, but
right,
more ideas for product features and all that kind of stuff. What was the process? Was it fairly informal, or just curious?
Yeah, no, it's like definitely informal, because when I realized, and it's very different than, corporate world, right? Like, you're going to get the best feedback actually when it's more informal. So, if I had reached out to some folks, especially in the first couple of weeks of the app, we have a feedback loop within the app, because I want to hear the good stuff, but it's really more important that I hear the bad stuff, like, or it's not fitting this need because of X. So anytime I got someone who was like, hey, great app, but I would ask them if they wanted to be part of kind of like what I call a product council. And I would then just kind of ping them with questions like, hey, we got a couple of requests from users to add this function. Is that something that you think you'd use? Is that, like a high priority? So it was just really more kind of casual conversations like that.
That's great.
I'm always interested in kind of the minimum viable product, MVP, and roadmap, and again, we have these shows, and I always feel that founders have such big ideas for what their product could be. How did you figure out what that first version should be and how you develop that? And you may have a great insight given your background, but how did you really think about developing a first iteration of your product?
Yeah, so it was really just, and I would consider like what was in the market now an MVP plus, right? So we definitely have, I have lofty aspirations in terms of what the next, couple of years look like in terms of functionality. But to get that MVP out, it was really just answering the question, and I needed to pick one. And me as a Vespa rider, like, what is the one thing that I need out of this app? And for me, it was being able to say which, like how fast roads are. So like my Vespa caps out at around 30 miles an hour. So my biggest thing, like MVP, was, okay, we need to do something where I can set my preferences to say, avoid all roads more than 20 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour. Or if they were on an e-scooter, avoid roads that are more than 15 miles an hour. That kind of gets you around those major roadways. So that's really, I'm not gonna lie, the first MVP was really based off of me as a user that then also spoke to other type of riders, not just moped riders.
And how'd you figure out, did you end up finding like a CTO or a co-founder, or did you do all the planning yourself and hire an outside team? How did you actually come to building a product?
Yeah, so I don't have a technical co-founder, but I did partner with a development shop here in Boston, who I gave my requirements to, and they were absolutely kind of like an extension of ScootRoute, right? They helped me do the proof of concept and then the overall development of it. And then obviously now that it's out and we're going to be looking for funding, as soon as we get funding, then I'll bring, the development in-house. And, I'm actively actually looking for a CTO. So if you know anyone.
I'm curious, Megan, with your background as a product manager, how has that helped you through the process? I would imagine that that's been valuable in knowing how it's not being a technical founder, but having that background, I imagine that that's been very useful.
It's huge, honestly. Just being able to have those kind of meaningful conversations with the technology team, like, do I understand it all? No, but I'm able to also be able to estimate a little bit better, or even kind of like push back. I a lot of times, like, they're like, all right, it's going to be, I don't even know, 100 hours or 150 hours to implement this feature or whatever it is. And it's nice to know, like, yeah, that's actually, from my experience, like, pretty reasonable. Or at the same time, like, we need to rein it in here, guys. Like, maybe it will take it to do that. Then, like, what are other options here to bring it down the hours, just to keep our kind of costs low, as low as much as we can. So having that background really helps, kind of just having like more transparent conversations with the development team, and not too much gets lost in translation.
I'm kind of curious on the other side of that, because I'm sure there's so many product managers that are out there that do the, are working on this every day and have some idea and say, I want to start something. Are there any things that were pitfalls or, issues because you were a product manager in starting your own?
I think yes, because if I wasn't a product manager, I would have absolutely had to find a technical co-founder from the get-go. And I think that I have yet to decide if that it's good or bad that I don't have one now. Like, I'm not that I'm struggling, but one of the key, hires for me now is a CTO or head of technology. And I think that I would have closed that gap a lot earlier on in the process if I didn't know kind of like how to run a technology product.
Right.
So I think that it's a little bit of a blessing and a curse.
Makes sense. So
Yeah. Go ahead, Tony.
no, I was just going to ask, so as far as the app goes, what are the technologies that are in play there? Obviously there's, it's a GPS type, it's tapping it through, but what else is in play, under the hood?
Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about it. Some of it's secret sauce. So we are actually patent pending, which is exciting. So we use OpenStreetMaps for the majority of like the street level data. And then we have a routing engine on top of that that is also open source. However, we have like additional ScootRoute logic on top of that is like obviously proprietary to ScootRoute that creates the routes. And then we have on top of the routing piece, like that gives you the turn by turn using the OpenStreetMaps data. But then we also have the actual tiles, the visual maps and roads that you see within the app. So they all kind of have to come together with the know-how of the ScootRoute logic to create, a cohesive route visually and, data-driven, basically.
Given where you're at now, what are you seeing as one of the biggest challenges for launching a new app? I would think in today's space, there's so many apps out there that, it's hard to really create your awareness and your space. But as you've kind of gone through this process, in launching an app, what have you found as some of the biggest challenges?
Yeah. So I think part of it is that, the App Store optimization. And that's one of the things that coming from fintech, that is not in my wheelhouse, right? Like it's quickly becoming in my wheelhouse, but, getting those that like App Store optimization and getting those users. So that's one thing that, I really wasn't expecting. I was hoping that by doing some PR and some marketing and, getting the name out there, I was like, oh yeah, awesome idea. Like, no, like it's paid acquisition per user, so that my kind of like marketing launch to get those users was not quite what I expected. I think we're on the right path now, absolutely. So I think we're going to see a lot of traction. And then also just kind of like that, I don't want to say dialogue, but the churn rate, right? Like if you have, if you're getting 100 downloads a day, but 99%, and this is not the case with ScootRoute, but and 99% of them are deleting the app the next day, right? Like, so it's not just, it's kind of like thinking through what those KPIs are. It's not just downloads, but you have to also then consider the churn rate and with the apps, like how many times they're coming back to the app, and also kind of what we're thinking about, because as you mentioned, there are so many apps out there. People are very limited, or they have only a few that they're willing to pay for, right? So from an app monetization perspective, is there trying to think through, is there an opportunity to have a paid version of the app, a premium version with some new pieces of functionality? And how much, would ScootRoute charge for that? So there's all just kind of being an app, it's just a very different kind of structure than it is like in, really any other business. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, we talk about churn all the time. I'm kind of curious, what kind of data do you really look at on a regular basis and subscribe to focusing on?
Yeah, so churn is definitely one of them. And then we have just overall for our KPIs, like daily active users and then monthly active users. We definitely look at overall downloads, but that's not like, for me, a true indicator. I love seeing more downloads, but as long as those, I want to see to make sure that those downloads actually turn into or increase our daily active users and our daily monthly users. So those are really the big ones.
Has there been anything that you've found so far in your launch, related to churn that, was a big kind of like, aha, like, oh, we need to make this change? Or has it been pretty steady in looking at, what's going on and maybe either making adjustments?
Yeah, for right now, it's kind of been pretty steady.
Okay.
But at the same time, like we've only been in the app stores for 6 months, and we haven't done like a huge push. I would expect over the next 3 months, as we do like a truly targeted kind of ASO and user acquisition plan, that we're going to be getting a lot more feedback. You know, we do get feedback through the loop in the app, and so that's where a lot of like my roadmap is kind of focusing on. But right now, like, we don't have a ton of churn, but I do think that we're going to see more as we start really growing our downloads on a more regular basis.
How did you approach user interface design? Because I think, you know, maybe in product management, you've got some insight, but then you've got a development team. And sometimes for me, I obviously think that like user interfaces is a different leg of the stool, right?
Absolutely.
And it's so important to churn. So how did you approach user interface design in creating this product?
Mm-hmm. So the development team actually that I work with had a UI UX expert, and they have done a fantastic job. Actually, we've won a couple of awards already for our user interface, which is great. So I just we thought through, you know, as a user, you're on a Vespa or you're on a bike or wherever you are, and you think about, okay, if you have it mounted, like I don't do the turn by turn. I have a mount on my Vespa. But like, so I'm riding and I want to zoom in really quickly at a stoplight or something. So you had to we thought through, okay, I want to zoom in on a specific route, like with one click, like how big can we make this button? And then there's no like taking 2 fingers and making it bigger or smaller, because that just takes too much time. It's like, okay, boop, I want to magnify by 2, and then it opens up it makes the map a little bit. So from a user experience, it wasn't just the like making a cool, like a good transition from how do you search for a route and then start your route and kind of all that, but overall like button placement of the actual app. Like, we don't want to have the stop button or whatever button down at the bottom, because a certain mount may cover that bottom button. So there was a lot of kind of thought in terms of what should the app, how do we make this app easy to use, not just in generating and creating their route before their start, but, you know, during the route as well.
During that like development period, did you and have other people go out in the physical world and utilize it? Because obviously with your app being so ingrained into the physical environment, I would assume testing isn't just sitting in a room clicking around, right? So
right.
You have to get out there.
Yeah. So I had a couple, you know, I had 2 or 3 riders, and I was like the #1 tester from a UI and like usability perspective. But even in, you know, I had a lot of people go around in their cars if they didn't have like a micromobility device, because even then, like, some of the mounts like are a little bit different, and obviously they need to be keeping their eyes on the road. And so I did have people go out and test, you know, in the actual, like on the roads, but not all of them were necessarily on mobility devices, but also in cars.
Going back to just kind of micro mobility in general, you know, you said that, you know, you had the idea for a long time. How did you, you know, what did you pay attention to as far as trends? And I think you mentioned a couple of the bikes that came out that helped you and the growth of that? What helped influence like when the time was right to go into this? Yeah,
I think, I mean, I always kept my eye on the trends, and honestly, I had never even heard of the term micromobility probably until like 2016, 2017. Like, if you had told me, I was like, yeah, I've got a moped, and
yeah,
okay, right? Like, so I feel like once I started, like, once there was a term like put around micromobility, that kind of like was a clue to me. And then I did really keep my eyes on both like kind of the shared micromobility providers, whether it was e-scooters like a Lime or Bird or Vio or any of those, but then also once like city bikes popped up, and there's shared bikes in, you know, like in Boston, the blue bikes are in Boston. And so once it was kind of clear that not only were there private micromobility companies, but then, you know, local governments and cities are providing opportunities for shared bikes. That's kind of was really the catalyst for me to get going.
Yeah, that's cool, and that's exactly what I was looking for. So I think that's interesting. Like once you heard that term and that label was out there, now that's like something, and you saw that growth. So that's pretty cool. Then as far as, you know, targeting your audience, what exists out there as far as, you know, like the niche communities of people who ride mopeds or, you know, e-scooters and that type of thing? You know, have you tapped into those? Are you active?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we're actually on May 1st, we're sponsoring a bike ride in DC, and it's called DMV Trails. And we are creating the routes for, I mean, one of them is a 100-mile route. And so there's all sorts of different bike clubs, moped clubs. We've talked with, you know, Vespas of DC as well. They have a huge, you know, Vespa community where they go out on rides. So there's like the scooter clubs, the bike clubs, but then there's also just commuters in general, right? I'm sure that you guys have heard the term last mile, where it's someone's coming in from the suburbs, coming into the city, at least they were pre-pandemic, and they need to get from the train station to their office, which is 1.5 miles away. So that's, you know, a lot of people, you know, rather than walking or taking the bus or whatever else is available, they'll hop on a shared micromobility device and kind of get to where they need to go. And then you have folks like, kind of like me, I don't have a commute anymore, but where I just want to go, it's like a beautiful day and I want to, you know, scoot down Comm Ave in Boston and enjoy the weather. So there's so many different ways that people can be utilizing their micromobility device.
And then one last question kind of on this topic, but how do you see, as far as trends go, how do you see, you know, micromobility changing, growing, given that shift from so many people that no longer have a commute because, you know, the pandemic, people are now working from home, and a lot of that's going to stick. What do you forecast and see in the future for this space?
Yeah, I actually think that it's going to, well, and that this is all the market research too. I can't take credit for it, but I mean, it's going to grow exponentially. I mean, they are saying, based off a McKinsey study, that in the US alone, it's going to be between $200 to $300 billion market by 2030. There is a silver lining with respect to micromobility for the pandemic. A lot of it being that people still want to social distance. So even if you are coming back into the city or going into an office, you may not necessarily be as comfortable taking the train or the bus that you used to be, or for that last mile, like don't take a bus. So I think that's one. And then I also think that just in general, it's like a cool way to travel. It's sustainable, it's environmentally friendly. It's not really, if you're not buying one, and even if you are buying one, there's, you know, relatively inexpensive options. So I just think that people are really going to start adopting it more, and we're going to start seeing a lot more cities being able to kind of like pivot and make it easier for micromobility devices to be used in the cities. I know that a lot of cities right now are spending a lot on infrastructure and putting in bike lanes. So I just think that it's going to be, it's a growing industry, and I think it's going to stay like that for a while.
It's very cool.
You mentioned the pandemic, and obviously that impacted everybody. I'm kind of curious how it impacted you as a startup.
Yeah.
You know, positively, negatively, because I mean, there could be some positive aspects given changing the way people are commuting and moving, but also negative. What was your experience through this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, as for everybody, it was an absolute roller coaster. So, I quit my job full time in November 2019. You're like, here we go, I'm doing it. And then the goal was to launch the app in like May, June timeframe of 2020. That obviously didn't happen, considering everybody was indoors. Like it was nothing like it is today. So there was kind of that panic, like, oh no, like what are we gonna do? Luckily, things did start opening up, and people really actually wanted something. Like you couldn't, in terms of like micromobility, you couldn't buy a new or even used bike, right? Last May and June. I think one of my sisters actually had to go, like drove to Rhode Island and got like the last used bike of Rhode Island for her 10-year-old son, because everybody needed something to do to get out of the house, and they needed to remain socially distanced. So that was like a comfort to me in terms of, okay, the market is absolutely still there. We're just going to push the launch out a little bit so that people are actually able to go outside and use their micromobility devices. And I think that, now micromobility may attract a different user base. So those who may not necessarily have really cared to try, or like a little too risk averse to try a micromobility device, now that they, don't necessarily want to take a bus or an Uber or whatever it is, that there might be more open to trying or buying a micromobility device.
I'm kind of curious randomly, are you having to factor in seasonality at all, and like location?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, it doesn't impact really the workings of the app, but just the overall market. So like in Boston, I'm not scooting around in January and February, unless it's like one of those crazy days where it's 70 degrees outside on like February 14th and there's no snow on the ground.
Right.
Kind of the same is true for some of the hotter cities. So one of my colleagues, she's in Phoenix, and now it's getting up to 100 degrees. And in the summer, it's going to be 120 degrees. And you're going to see micromobility devices kind of like melting on the sidewalk. So there it just gets too hot, right? So we're going to see, I feel we'll see like in our analytics of that seasonality of usage. So when it comes to monthly users or daily active users, I think we're going to see obviously spikes in certain areas and complete drop-offs in certain areas as well.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, for folks out there that have apps is thinking about that from a data perspective, because I always say, avoiding these high level stats. And if you probably look at daily active users across everything, it's going to tell a completely different story than by locale.
Right. Yes. So I would want like those KPIs for Boston, right? Like I would say, all right, I want to see an increase of daily active users in Boston from April to October. And then kind of the same for Arizona, but it's probably going to be like September to April. And as long as that's the kind of the time of year for micromobility use, I'm going to take a look at that. If we see a huge dip in ridership in Boston in December, I'm not going to worry too much about it.
You talked a little bit earlier, you kind of mentioned premium features. I'm curious, what's the monetization strategy for the app, now and going into the future? Yeah.
So we have a couple of strategies. One, I mean, the free app version, we're not going to see, unless we get to the point where we have millions and millions of users, right? Like the ad revenue from in-app advertising isn't going to keep us, in business. But we do have API solutions that we can integrate in with some of these, or all of them, but shared scooter providers, and then also different city bikes. So if a user, for example, is getting a shared scooter, they open up their app, they would stay within that like Fleet's app, but then they could also, we would provide the turn-by-turn directions directly in that shared scooter company. So it would be more of like a licensing agreement with some of the micromobility shared scooter providers.
That's great. Just because it's a big topic right now, how are you approaching privacy? Because obviously there's probably some data of where people are connected to who they are. And I was kind of thinking, oh, you could monetize that data to give people a sense of like, what routes tend to get that type of traffic. But then, that does get into that privacy question. So how are you guys looking at privacy?
Yeah, so actually right now we don't have any concept, we don't have any sort of user login for that sole reason, because we are new, eventually we are going to have to do that. So we really have no idea, like even when I use it, we don't know that it's like me doing this route from, the south end of Boston to my sister's in Brooklyn. But going forward, we will absolutely have to, start having some sort of login. And, the goal would not be to really collect the information about that user, just more in terms of where are people riding? Are they taking routes that ScootRoute like didn't provide within their route? Why? So that we can then kind of make a smart, have AI on top of it to make our routes smarter as people use it. But data privacy is a big one for us. We're actually getting a lot of requests from global markets to bring it to, France and Italy and the Philippines and Australia. But those data privacy requirements are different than the US and more stringent. So that's kind of like our one barrier to get there. Not that we can't do it, but something that we are considering, we have to consider very heavily before we open up to those markets.
Now that you mention it, some of those markets are much more into,
Absolutely.
The space. Was there any consideration in the beginning to go to Indonesia or, other cities where they maybe use local mobility a little bit differently?
I had never really thought about it. I had always thought like US, and part of that was my bias and that I wanted it for me. But over the past 2 months, I have kind of been thinking through like, should we have started, in some of those different markets? Because there are certain cities where, mopeds and micromobility is huge outside of the US. But we're kind of where we are right now.
Right.
And we do have the goal to be opening up to the larger markets, to like the global markets. And that will probably be, hopefully end of this year, beginning of next year. So we're not too far behind.
So Megan, what are some of the goals here for the next 12 months, let's say? I think you said that you're looking to raise some funding, correct?
Yes. Yep. So we're starting our pre-seed seed round in May. Kind of part of that will be hiring, some additional resources. Number one being, a CTO, and then also pulling in, maybe even like another product person. We need a couple of engineers. And that is really to be able for us to quickly, get some items off of our product roadmap, including in that is global, and then also adding in that kind of like AI learning on top of, our existing algorithm and logic.
Cool. So can you share a little bit about that, the concept of the AI learning?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just using our data in terms of, as we get more riders, trying to figure out how are they, which routes are they taking, which ones, like if they are deviating off of it, why, and then also being able to incorporate different city guidelines, right? Like, so Boston has certain guidelines in terms of where and where you can't use a moped or an electric device. LA has a very different rules. They have geofencing where they're not allowed at all, like on certain boardwalks or things that you would think that you should be able to scoot on. So it's really being able to incorporate all of this information and creating the smartest route depending on your actual like locale.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. You mentioned raising money, and that's always a hot topic for founders.
Yeah.
And you may not have a ton of insight into the process, but I'm always interested in, what's the approach to go after funding? What are the big, challenges? Just any insight that you have about that.
Yeah, so I'm definitely, we're at the beginning phases. And so it's really kind of making those connections first. So it's almost like cold calling. And in order to just say, hey, I think this might be something that you'd be interested in, or do you want feedback? So really making those relationships before your second call to them, which is then, okay, now I need money, right? So it's hard, and it's just building that pipeline of potential investors that you think you fit inside their portfolio. And I mean, it's what I wasn't expecting is that it's a full-time job, and it is a legitimate full-time job.
Yeah, that's almost literally what we hear every time we talk about it, is that it's a full-time job, and that's what founders don't realize, and why you almost need to build a full team or have co-founders, because someone's got to be, chasing money all the time.
Exactly. And honestly, like, people have told me that over and over again. Like, before I started, like, yep, it's going to be full-time. Like, yeah. It's a full-time job.
That's funny.
Yeah.
And we've had a couple, female founders on, and they've talked about some of the challenges of raising money, just because sometimes in the startup space, it can be a little bit of boys club. Have you seen any of that yet, or has that gone through your head?
So it has definitely gone through my head, and the number that you're looking for is 2% of VC money goes to female founders, which is like scary, and it's honestly a deterrent for women founders, because sometimes you're like, why bother? If 2%, like, why bother? Luckily, I haven't, and this is also could be because like I'm in the very beginning stages. I haven't had any, like meetings where I felt that I was at a disadvantage because I was a woman. But there's also kind of a plus side in that there are so many communities, like startup communities, that are focused. Sole purpose is to help women founders. So I think getting, for any woman founder who's listening, like getting into those networks is absolutely huge. And it is helpful. Like, everybody wants to help another, like woman founded company succeed, whether it's providing, advisory service for a business plan, or for intros to VCs where they think you might be a good fit, or whatever it is, or just hey, I'm literally going to lose my brain, like going on, like, I just need someone, a sounding board, like something. There are communities beyond communities out there, and it's really important for people to tap into. And so I think from that perspective, there is a bit of an advantage, being a woman founder, and that those communities are so accepting.
What kind of resources have you used? Have you gotten involved with any incubators? What are some of those communities you talked about? And then, mentors. Have you gotten, involved in any mentorship programs?
Yeah, so I'm actually part of an accelerator program called New Chip. It's actually, are you familiar with it? I had never really heard of it. It's relatively new, but it's all virtual, which is great. So there's no kind of shipping off to Y Combinator and in California or anything like that. And that has been an invaluable resource in terms of, kind of just thinking through some business problems. You have a mentor, pitch deck reviews, access to investors, things like that. And then on the non kind of accelerator side, like in Boston, there's the Startup Coalition, which is fantastic. And then I Fund Women, which is a crowdfunding platform for women-founded businesses, and the Capital Network. So there's a whole, no matter where you are or where you're located, there is always like a huge startup community that you can tap into for sure.
Yeah, I agree.
So how do you see the whole space that you're working in, Meghan, evolving and changing here in the next couple of years, and how does ScootRoute fit into that?
Yeah, so I think kind of what I was mentioning before in terms of city regulations and infrastructure, I think a lot of that is really going to drive the user behavior of micromobility riders. And the goal then would be for ScootRoute to be able to kind of take all of that information and provide a very easy way for users to kind of digest that information and then provide them a route that they don't really have to think about. So my goal is to be kind of like the one-stop shop for everything like micromobility, routing, and regulatory, basically. But that has to be driven by the cities.
How do you see the competitive landscape? I know that Google Maps releases new features, and they've got a new walking feature. Obviously, you mentioned Waze. For your app, how did you look at previously to building and going into the future, the competitive landscape of, just kind of, I guess I'd call it mobility solutions in general?
Yeah. So, right now, it's a huge white space. So there's no one who's really doing what we're doing specifically for micromobility. Obviously, Google and Waze, they could potentially get into that space. However, that's why we wanted to get our patent application out there. And then, so that's kind of like one competitor set of competitors that we are keeping our eye on. And then really the only other ones out there would be someone like a Lime or a Bird, where they have mapping in their app. However, that has nothing to do with navigation. It's more just where are their scooters located so that they, a rider can then go and find it. But it is something that, obviously I want to become, before anyone does anything more with their mapping solutions, I want to be like the household name, kind of like Waze was before Google scooped them up. So as long as we can become the household name, ScootRoute is the mapping technology that micromobility trusts. I'm happy.
You mentioned household name. We always like BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal. Is there some big, hairy, audacious goal in your head of like, this is what we'd like to be or achieve in the next year or two?
Yeah, and I think my big goal is like, I want to be the Waze of micromobility, right? That I want to be anyone who's getting on a micromobility device, I want them to immediately open up ScootRoute and use it.
Yeah, it's great.
It's very cool.
So I typically have a question, that I ask towards the end of these shows, more about the future and opening it up, just because we're dealing with folks that I think are tapped into unique technologies and ideas. And so I'm interested in, over the next 10 years, is there a technology or an innovative change in the way that we do things that you're really excited about or interested in, whether it's artificial intelligence or any of these really bleeding edge technologies that are kind of coming to light right now?
Yeah, I think that really anything, like when we talk about like the Internet of Things, like I love and I get excited about the way that different hardwares are talking to each other from different providers, right? So like if you think about anyone on a scooter, that you can also then have a smart helmet that has been developed by someone else. I think that's cool. Or there's other kind of companies out there where you have a device on your it's on your phone or whatever it is, where if someone's coming like from behind you, or there's like a car within your peripheral vision, or that may be risky for you, right? So I think what I get excited about is not just only like the advances in each of the hardware items or the software pieces, but how they all interact together, because that's when I think that it's going to be like a really cool kind of system.
Yeah, that's really neat. I started picturing in my head a helmet that's connected to your app, and if someone's getting too close, the color of the map.
Like all of a sudden, like my app is red, like I love it.
Exactly.
Because that's one of the biggest barriers for people in micromobility, right? Is that safety factor. Like they need to feel safe in order to get on a device. So there's so many things out there that if they can all talk together and it's kind of like a cohesive solution, it'll be fantastic.
Yeah, that's really cool.
That's great. Well, where can we learn more about ScootRoute, Megan?
Oh, I'm all over the place. So you can reach me at ScootRoute.com. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, even on our website at the bottom, there's an email address. To be honest, I think either info or support, I can't remember, at ScootRoute.com, but it's there. And, we are small enough at this point that we always respond. So if anyone has any feedback or anything like that, we're always happy to hear it and to hear from our users.
That's fantastic. Well, we want to thank you, Megan, for joining. Really cool stuff you have going on. We wish you much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Loved being here.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan.
Well, thanks, everybody. We will see you next time. And once again, Meghan Braley from ScootRoute. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.